My parents' divorce tore our family apart, and I was caught in the middle, forced to choose between love, loyalty, and my own future before losing everything. I never thought my parents would be the kind of people to blindside me like this. After 35 years of marriage, 3.5 decades of what seemed like a solid partnership, they sat me down at the dinner table and announced their divorce like it was the weather forecast. No preamble, no warning signs, just a calm, matter-of-fact statement. We've decided to separate. I didn't know what to say. I looked back and forth between them, expecting some kind of follow-up, some reasoning that would make sense of what I'd just heard. But instead, there was only silence. At first, I tried to stay neutral. I told myself that I was an adult, that I could handle this without picking sides. They were both still my parents, and if they had fallen out of love or simply decided they wanted different things, that was their business. I wasn't a child caught in the middle of a custody battle. I was a grown man with my own life, my own marriage, my own problems. But that illusion didn't last long. Almost immediately, both of them started pulling me in opposite directions, as if I was some kind of prize to be won in the wreckage of their marriage. My mother started calling me daily, always with a tone of wounded martyrdom, subtly implying that my father had wronged her in some unforgivable way without ever actually saying what he had done. My father, on the other hand, was colder, more distant than I'd ever known him to be. He expected me to be rational, to take his side as if it was the logical thing to do, as if staying neutral was an act of betrayal in itself. I told them both, over and over, that I wasn't going to take sides, that I loved them both, that I just wanted to keep some semblance of family intact. But as old family secrets started surfacing, neutrality became impossible. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a war. And whether I wanted to or not, I was right in the middle of it. At first, I thought I could handle it. I told myself it was just a phase, that the dust would settle, and that my parents would find some way to navigate their separation without making it my problem. But that hope died quickly. The manipulation started almost immediately. My mother called me nearly every night, her voice laced with exhaustion and an unspoken expectation that I would take her side. "I just don't know how I'm going to do this alone," she would say, never outright asking for help, but always implying that she needed me to step up. Sometimes, she reminisced about all she had sacrificed for our family, listing the years she spent as a devoted wife, how much of herself she had given up. The message was clear: I owed her. My father, on the other hand, played a different game. He wasn't emotional. He was practical, detached. "This divorce is getting messy," he'd mention in passing, like he was discussing business. "She's being unreasonable, as always." Then, after a pause, he'd add, "I assume you'll be fair about this if it comes to legal proceedings." Every conversation felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of resentment. Any attempt to stay neutral was met with disappointment or passive-aggressive remarks. My father expected loyalty in the name of reason, and my mother expected devotion in the name of love. Then came the real battleground, the house. The home where I had grown up, where every family memory was tied, became their biggest fight. My mother was adamant that she had a right to keep it. "He wants to erase everything we built," she told me one night, her voice thick with anger. "He's acting like none of it ever mattered." When I confronted my father about it, he barely looked up. "We can't afford to keep that place," he said, his tone dismissive. "Your mother's being sentimental, as usual." I was caught between them, suffocating under the weight of their expectations. If I sided with my mother, I was enabling her irrationality. If I backed my father, I was cruel. No matter what I said or did, one of them felt betrayed. And the worst part? The stress of it all didn't stay contained. It started creeping into my own marriage, poisoning the stability I had worked so hard to build. I told myself I wouldn't let their divorce affect my own life. I repeated it like a mantra: this is their problem, not mine. But no matter how much I tried to separate myself from it, the stress seeped in, spreading like a slow-moving poison. It started with my mood. I was constantly on edge, irritable in ways I had never been before. My wife, Emily, noticed immediately. She would ask me what was wrong, and I would brush it off, saying work had been stressful or that I was just tired. But I wasn't fooling her. She knew it was my parents. At first, she was patient. She listened when I vented, held my hand when I stared off into space, trying to untangle my feelings. But as the weeks dragged on, my parents' war continued escalating, and I became more and more consumed by it. Emily started to pull back, not because she didn't care, but because she was tired of watching me let them drag me down. "I feel like I'm losing you to their mess," she said one night. And that hit me like a punch to the gut. Because she was right. The phone calls were endless. My mother sobbing about my father's betrayal, my father ranting about how she was trying to bleed him dry. Every day, another argument, another demand to pick a side. The worst part was that they weren't just talking about each other anymore. They were talking about me. He's disappointed me, my mother admitted in one of her late-night calls. I thought I raised a son who would stand by me. My father, cold and practical as ever, simply stated, I hope you understand what this means for our relationship. You're either with me or you're not. I wanted to scream. To tell them both how unfair this was, how much I hated being used as leverage in their battle. But I couldn't, because I knew it wouldn't change anything. And the more I let myself be consumed by their fight, the more my own life started to crumble. I snapped at Emily over stupid things, dishes left in the sink, texts I forgot to respond to, small annoyances that had never mattered before. I spent more time thinking about my parents' problems than my own marriage. And the worst part? I could feel the distance growing between us. One night, I was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, exhausted but unable to sleep. Emily turned to me and whispered, I don't know how much more of this I can take. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just at risk of losing my parents, I was at risk of losing my own family, too. Wish I could say that was the wake-up call I needed, that I immediately set boundaries and took control of my life again. But that would be a lie. Even after Emily told me she was struggling, I couldn't just shut my parents out. I told myself I was doing the right thing, that I was keeping the peace, that if I just endured their calls, their arguments, their constant attempts to pull me in, then maybe, just maybe, it would all settle down. It didn't. Instead, things got worse. The divorce proceedings turned vicious. My father was determined to liquidate everything, to sell the house, to cut all ties as quickly as possible. My mother fought back, refusing to give up the home she had lived in for decades. And I was caught right in the middle, forced to listen to both of them tear each other apart. You know how selfish your father is, my mother spat one night, her voice thick with anger. He never cared about this family. He only cares about his money. Hours later, my father called with his own version of events. She's manipulating you, he said, his tone flat. She wants to play the victim so you'll feel sorry for her. She's always done this. The worst part? I could see both of their perspectives. My mother had spent most of her life as a wife, a mother, building a home she thought would be permanent. And my father, practical and ruthless, was treating this like a business deal, cutting his losses and moving forward. And then, the secrets started coming out. My aunt, my mother's sister, called me one night out of nowhere. She wasn't someone I talked to often, but she sounded hesitant, almost nervous. There's something you should know, she said. Something your mother hasn't told you. I didn't want to hear it. But at the same time, I needed to. And that's when she told me about the affair. Not my father's. My mother's. She had been involved with someone else years ago, before I was born. According to my aunt, my father had known about it, had stayed anyway, had chosen to bury it for the sake of keeping the family together. And now, decades later, all that buried resentment was coming to the surface. I sat there, gripping my phone so tightly my hand ached. My entire childhood had been built on the foundation of my parents' seemingly stable marriage, and now I had to wonder if any of it had been real. I confronted my mother the next day. She didn't deny it. She just looked at me with tired eyes and said, "It doesn't matter now." But it did. Because in that moment, I realized their divorce wasn't just about them. It was about everything that had been simmering under the surface for decades, all the lies, the resentment, the compromises they had made. And suddenly, I wasn't just caught in their battle, I was questioning my entire understanding of my family. And I had no idea what to do with that. After learning about my mother's affair, I felt like I had been thrown into a different version of my own life, one where nothing was what it seemed, and every memory I had was now tainted by the possibility of deception. I tried to act normal, but I could feel the weight of this new knowledge pressing down on me. When I spoke to my father, I found myself studying him in a way I never had before, looking for signs of the man who had chosen to stay, to raise me despite knowing my mother had betrayed him. Had he resented me? Had he ever looked at me and wondered if I was even his? I wanted to ask, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words. Instead, I let the knowledge eat away at me in silence. And as if things weren't bad enough, the divorce battle escalated into something even more toxic. My mother, who had once played the role of heartbroken wife, now seemed determined to hurt my father in any way she could. He wants to start over? She scoffed one evening. Fine, but I'll make sure he has nothing to start over with. And she did. She fought him for every dollar, contested every asset, dragged out the legal process for as long as possible. She even called me, her voice dripping with controlled rage, saying, "I just want to make sure you're not helping him behind my back." Helping him? As if I was some kind of spy in their war, planted in the middle to gather information for the enemy. Meanwhile, my father responded with equal ruthlessness. He stopped speaking to her entirely and instead directed his frustrations at me. "She's gone completely insane," he said in a clipped tone. "And if she drags you down with her, that's on you." I wanted to scream at both of them. But instead, I just sank deeper into exhaustion, into the realization that no matter what I did, I would always be the collateral damage in their battle. And the stress of it all? It wasn't just affecting me anymore. It was affecting Emily. She had been patient, more patient than I deserved, but one night, as I sat at the kitchen table scrolling through my phone, waiting for the inevitable next call from one of my parents, she sat across from me and said, "I can't do this anymore." I looked up, startled. "Do what?" "This." She gestured at me. "Watching you get swallowed up by them." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell her I was handling it, but she shook her head. "You're not. And you're not even trying to protect yourself from it." I hated that she was right. I hated that I had let this consume me to the point that my own wife, my own marriage, was now on the verge of cracking under the weight of my parents' destruction. And yet, even in that moment, I couldn't imagine a way out. Because every time I tried to step back, one of them would pull me right back in. I told myself I had to set boundaries. That was the only way out of this mess. If I didn't, I was going to lose more than just my peace of mind. I was going to lose my marriage, my sense of self, everything. So I made a plan. I would answer fewer calls, stop getting involved in their legal fights, and, most importantly, refuse to be used as a weapon in their war. I even rehearsed conversations in my head, imagining all the ways I would tell them, firmly but gently, that I wasn't their messenger, their emotional crutch, or their battleground. But, of course, it wasn't that simple. The first time I ignored one of my mother's calls, she left a long voicemail, filled with disappointment and the weight of everything she had done for me. She made it clear that she never thought her own child would distance himself from her after everything she had sacrificed. The second time, she sent a message. She didn't demand a response, but the words carried a clear message. She saw my silence as a choice. My father, in contrast, didn't reach out as often. When I told him I didn't want to discuss the divorce anymore, he responded with a single statement about how he shouldn't have expected support from me. That word stayed in my mind for days. Support. Was that what this was about? A test of loyalty? A demand to prove which parent I valued more? If that was the case, I had already lost. Then, everything escalated again. One evening, my mother called, not crying, not pleading, but filled with anger. She had just learned that my father had updated his will, removing her from everything. It was no longer just about the divorce or their personal history. Now, my name was at the center of the next stage of their battle. I hadn't known about any of it. She believed my father had done it purely to hurt her, not because of any genuine decision about his assets. And in her eyes, I had become the person standing in the middle of that choice. I called my father afterward, and he confirmed everything without hesitation. He had no intention of letting her gain anything from him, and if that meant leaving everything to me instead, then that was what he was going to do. There was nothing I could say to change his mind. Nothing I could do to separate myself from the damage that had already been done. No matter how much I tried to remain neutral, my name was now written into the fight in a way that I couldn't erase. And the worst part? I wasn't even sure if there was anything left to salvage. This is great feedback. I'll make sure the second half of the story is more dynamic, reducing repetition, increasing concrete conflicts, and creating a clearer climax. I'll now write part 7, ensuring a faster pace and a strong build-up toward the resolution. Here it is. After learning about my father's will, I realized that I was no longer just a bystander in their divorce. I had become a key player in their war, whether I wanted to or not. The days that followed were filled with tension. My mother, now convinced that my father had used me to hurt her, treated me differently. She didn't beg for my support anymore. Instead, there was a distance between us, a cold politeness that felt even worse than her previous emotional outbursts. My father, on the other hand, acted as if I should be grateful. To him, this wasn't a burden, it was an inheritance, a reward for standing by him. But I hadn't stood by anyone. And then, the situation took another turn. A legal notice arrived at my apartment, an official document stating that my mother was challenging the will. She was prepared to fight for the house, for assets, for everything she believed was rightfully hers. And since my name was now attached to my father's estate, that meant I was directly involved. This wasn't just about their divorce anymore. It was about me. Emily saw the exhaustion in my face as I read through the documents. She had been patient for months, but I could tell she was reaching her own breaking point. "You need to end this," she told me, her voice steady. But how? Every attempt to set boundaries had failed. Every time I tried to remove myself from their fight, something pulled me back in. Now, it wasn't just emotional, it was legal. For the first time, I started thinking about what cutting contact would actually mean. Could I live with that choice? Would I be able to walk away from both of them if this battle never ended? And more importantly, if I didn't act soon, how much more of myself would I lose? I stared at the legal notice for hours, feeling completely drained. This wasn't just about my parents' toxic divorce anymore. My name was now in legal paperwork, entangled in a fight I never agreed to join. For days, I avoided calling either of them. I knew that if I picked up, it would just be more manipulation, more demands, more blame. But avoiding them didn't stop the pressure. My mother left messages reminding me that she had given up everything for our family, that my father had rewritten history to punish her. My father sent short, emotionless texts saying that the sooner she accepted reality, the better. Neither of them saw me as a person anymore. I was just a tool in their fight. Emily watched all of this unfold with growing frustration. She had always been supportive, but this was different. One night, she sat across from me at the dinner table and told me that she couldn't do this forever. She loved me, but my inability to step away from their drama was destroying our relationship. And she was right. The next morning, I did something I had been avoiding for months. I called a lawyer, not for them, but for myself. I needed to understand my options. I needed to know if there was a way to legally remove myself from this mess. The meeting was brutal. My name on the will meant I had legal responsibilities, and my mother's challenge meant I would be dragged into hearings whether I liked it or not. The only way to truly escape was to make a decision, fight for the inheritance or give it all up. The idea of giving up everything my father left me made me feel sick. It wasn't about the money. It was about what it symbolized, the last shred of power I had in this situation. But holding on to it meant being tied to their endless battle, possibly for years. I went home that night, sat in silence for a long time, and made my choice. For the first time in months, I felt like I was taking control. And I knew exactly what I had to do next. I called my father first. I told him I didn't want the inheritance, the house, or anything that kept me tied to this fight. His reaction was immediate, cold, distant, almost dismissive. He told me that if I gave it up, my mother would win. But this was never about winning. I told him I was done. I wasn't going to be a part of their war anymore. No more legal battles, no more late-night calls filled with manipulation, no more being used as a pawn between two people who had long stopped seeing me as their son. When I called my mother next, her reaction was the opposite. She didn't try to argue, she simply sounded tired. Maybe she thought this meant she had won. Or maybe she had finally realized that dragging me into this had cost her something more important than a house or money. Neither of them begged me to reconsider. And that told me everything I needed to know. The next day, I met with my lawyer and formally signed away my claim to the inheritance. I removed myself from the legal battle completely. I was no longer a part of it. My father could do whatever he wanted with his estate. My mother could continue fighting if she chose to. But I wouldn't be there to see it. When I walked out of that office, for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The weight of their expectations, their resentment, their endless manipulations, it was no longer mine to carry. I didn't know if they would ever forgive me for stepping away, but I finally understood that their approval was no longer something I needed to chase. But there was still one thing left to fix. I went home to Emily, sat down beside her, and told her everything. Not just about my decision, but about how much I had let my parents' chaos control my life, how I had ignored the damage it had done to our marriage, how I had failed to put us first. She listened without saying anything for a long time. Then, finally, she reached for my hand. There was no instant fix, no guarantee that things would go back to the way they were before. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking backward. I was ready to move forward. And this time, I knew exactly who I was choosing, myself, my wife, and the future we were building together. Cutting myself out of my parents' war didn't erase the damage overnight. Even after signing away the inheritance, after telling them both that I was done, there was still a lingering sense of loss. Not for the money or the house, but for the family that had once seemed unbreakable. In the weeks that followed, things were eerily quiet. My mother stopped calling, and my father barely acknowledged me. It was as if, by refusing to take part in their battle, I had erased myself from their new reality. At first, that silence felt like punishment. But over time, it started to feel like freedom. Without the constant weight of their divorce pressing down on me, I had space to breathe again. I spent more time with Emily, and for the first time in months, our conversations weren't filled with tension. We started reconnecting in small ways, cooking dinner together, going for late-night walks, laughing about things that had nothing to do with my parents. It wasn't perfect, but it was healing. Then, one day, an unexpected message arrived. It was from my mother. There was no guilt, no accusations, just a simple acknowledgement. She had lost sight of what really mattered. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure if I wanted to. But eventually, I realized that I didn't need an apology or closure from either of them. The only thing I needed was the ability to move forward on my own terms. So I did. I stopped waiting for them to change, stopped hoping for the version of my parents that I had once believed in. Instead, I focused on the life in front of me. My marriage, my career, my future. I don't know if my parents will ever truly fix the damage between them, or with me. But for the first time, that's not my burden to carry. And as I stood on my back porch one evening, watching the sunset with Emily beside me, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace.